The year 1919 was one of the most explosive times in the history of the American labor movement. Some 4 million workers took part in more than 3,000 strikes nationwide. In nearly every case, labor lost. Wartime successes and peacetime disappointments set the stage for this catastrophic year for workers. Workers raised expectations, helped create the crisis. During the war, President Wilson sought good relations with workers who were keeping the troops clothed and equipped. Organized labor won many gains, including shorter hours and higher wages. When the war ended, labor leaders hoped to build on what they had achieved. They were disappointed. A number of factors combined to frustrate labor's high hopes. Wilson now focused on promoting his peace plan, paid less attention to events at home, and did little to promote workers' causes. Meanwhile, the sinking post-war demand for factory goods hurt many industries. Returning soldiers expected to take their place on the factory floor, but jobs weren't there. Unhappy workers, especially strikers, were replaced. The Red Scare further weakened labor by damaging its reputation. Communism's call to workers to rise up and overthrow their government made many people suspicious of organized labor. Opponents linked labor with the radical ideas that so many people feared. The showdown between labor and management in 1919 devastated organized labor. Unions lost, members and national political power. It would take another decade and another national crisis to restore organized labor's reputation, status, and bargaining power in the United States. Among the thousands of union strikes that rocked the country in 1919, a few hold a place in the labor history. In Seattle, Washington, a labor unrest at the shipyard spread citywide, igniting what became the nation's first major general strike, one in which workers in all industries took part. The conflict virtually shut down the city, yet the Seattle General Strike of 1919 failed to achieve any gains for workers. In fact, it did great harm. For years afterward, industry and its jobs stayed away from Seattle. On the opposite coast, the city of Boston descended into chaos when its police force went on strike in September 1919 to protest low wages and poor working conditions. Eventually, Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge called in the state's militia to end the strike. It was another loss for labor, but a great political boost for the Republican governor. In a telegram to the famous labor leader Samuel Gompers, Coolidge wrote, "There can be no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." The words echoed across the nervous country and made Coolidge a hero. His sudden fame, used as a champion of law and order, elevated his career to the national stage and eventually landed him in the White House. Other notable strikes hit the steel industry and the coal fields of the eastern United States. The United Mine Workers had kept a no strikes pledge during the war. Under the tough new leadership of John L. Lewis, the striking union won a large major wage increase. Workers failed, however, to win other key demands, such as a reduction of their work week to 5 days. Lewis recognized the limitations of the union's powers at that time. "We cannot fight the government," the labor leader declared. His miners, like union members throughout the country, would have to wait to press their demands for shorter hours and safer workplaces. Competition for scarce jobs combined with the Red Scare triggered an ugly backlash against foreigners in the post-war period. The rise of nativism or distrust of foreigners produced a culture clash between the nation's earlier immigrants and its newer ones. Many nativists were Protestant Christians who had their roots in northern and western Europe, the source of most immigration before 1900. The nativists targeted newer arrivals from southern and eastern Europe, many of whom were Catholics and Jews. Immigrants from these areas of Europe, nativists argued, were less willing to become Americanized and should not be welcomed. Labor leaders, along with the nativists, pushed for immigration restrictions on these groups. New arrivals, often poor and alone, were willing to work for low wages. Unions saw them as a threat. The federal government responded to nativist concern by passing laws to limit immigration. A 1921 law established a quota, an established number, of immigrants to be allowed into the United States from various nations. The National Origins Act of 1924 even went further. It set quotas for countries at 2% of the number of people from that country living in the United States in 1890. The goal was clearly to reduce immigration to the U.S. from certain countries, mainly Southern and Eastern European countries. The act also nearly eliminated all immigrants from Asian countries. Nativism also produced a revival of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan had started as a terror group that targeted African Americans in the South. It reemerged in post-war years with a broader mission. The hate group now targeted Jews, Catholics, and radicals of all types. a Klan slogan in the 1920s, characterized the group's mission of the nation: native white Protestant supremacy. The new KKK of the 1920s also moved out of the South into other parts of the United States. In the 1920s, a court case in Massachusetts dramatically illustrated the nation's struggle with nativist and anti-radical feelings. In May 1920, two men, Nikolai Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were arrested for armed robbery and murder. The two men were Italian immigrants. More importantly, they proclaimed that they were anarchists, radicals who sought the destruction of government. At the trial, it became clear that the evidence against the two men was weak. It was also apparent that Sacco and Vanzetti were on trial for their political beliefs as well as for bank robbery and murder. Amid great publicity and protests in Europe and South America, as well as in the United States, the two men were convicted and sentenced to die. They were executed in 1927. Historians still argue over the guilt or innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti. Many agree, however, that the men's political ideas played a prominent role in the trial. Vanzetti expressed the same ideas before his trial. He quoted, "My conviction is that I have suffered for things I am guilty of. I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am Italian." The execution of Sacco and Vanzetti were highly controversial at the time. By then, however, the nation had largely recovered from the Red Scare and turmoil of the post-war years. The 1920s was very different from the previous decade. Okay, now I need you to go back to Class Jump and answer the question. How do you think nativism might have related to the Red Scare?